In today's video, I'm going to tell you guys how to make better and more fun combat encounters. Let's go. There are way more things that make combat encounters fun than just hit it until it runs out of hit points. I'm going to talk about timing, the environment, intensity, and frequency of combats. Also, how to manage your action economy just that little bit better. And we're going to talk about how to adjust monsters on the fly, give them a few interesting abilities. Hopefully, this will make your encounters way more fun for you as a DM, as well as for your players. Let's get into it. First, I'm going to talk about using the environment. The place you're fighting in and how it relates to the monsters should be reflected in the combat itself. Using things like cliffs or snow or running water or mud, all these things can create interesting terrain environmental issues that your players will have to overcome while in combat. How is the weather in your encounter? Is it raining? Is there a thunderstorm, or is it a bright shiny day? And perhaps the sunset itself is shining so brightly that the paladin might be able to glean it off their shield and blind the enemies with it. Consider giving your players some of these extra little tips and tricks that they might be able to use in the combat. These things specifically, the example I give of shining a bright light and having it have the blinding effect on the enemies, are really great for low level combats where your players don't have access to a huge amount of abilities yet. And it can just add a little bit more depth to your combat environment. Add items in your environment that can be interacted with, such as boulders. Perhaps there's a pit that you're aware of that someone had dug previously. Fighting in a tavern where tables have fallen over and there's glasses and other things that could be splashed in people's faces. When you think about your environment for combat, don't just think about the environment itself, but think about how things could possibly be inside there that the players might be able to utilize, as well as the enemies, of course. Remember, sometimes giving your enemies a way to escape where your players can't follow is also a really interesting part of the environment for a combat encounter. And vice versa. Maybe your players want to escape too, because they're a little bit scared that they're getting beaten. Always have that option available and allow for the environment to easily provide that. Stop. While I've got you here, go and become a free member on my Patreon, because it's free and there's lots of stuff there every single week and you can get it for free. And did I mention it's free? And also hit that like and subscribe button down there, guys. That's also free. You're awesome and I love you, and thank you for being here and watching this amazing video. I'm sure you're thoroughly entertained by all my stupid antics so far. There's also links down below. You can go and check those out. Stuff on the DMs Guild. Check out what I did for Kraken Week last week. Crab battle. All right, back to the video. Okay, next I'm going to talk about timing. I don't mean timing in the sense of waiting for something to happen. I mean timing as how long should it take. Timing can be very tough in Dungeons & Dragons as a dice system is very swingy itself. However, making sure every player gets a turn is a very good start. Enemies shouldn't be defeated so easily that they all go down in one single round of combat, unless either your players get very, very lucky or it's supposed to be that easy. There are many things that can kind of dictate the time of a combat. One of these obviously is the monster's HP and your player's HP pools, but I wouldn't solely rely on that as an indication of how well your combat has gone. A good rule of thumb that I like to follow personally is look at the damage output from both the players and the enemy. If the players are doing much more damage per round than the enemy should only last 2 to 3 rounds in combat. If the enemy is putting out more damage than the players, the combat should definitely last at least 5 rounds. Some combats can take much more time and go up to 10 rounds or even more. These are what we call a slog. Unless there's something interesting and intricate happening during those rounds, like lair actions or some kind of environmental detail, perhaps there's a second objective in this encounter as well, not just beat the enemy, but beat the enemy and protect someone or get the MacGuffin. That kind of combat is okay to go for a long time. However, this will feel definitely very long. In real time, combats take far longer than they actually take inside the game. If your combat is taking up to 10 rounds, don't just let it be a slap fest from either side. Okay, next, I'm going to talk about frequency and intensity of your combats. Deciding how often your players should engage in combat can be difficult sometimes. How many encounters you should have in a given day is outlined in the Dungeon Master's Guide. However, I tend to choose how many encounters my players and groups have based on more of what I want to see them fight or more of what they want to fight in the coming encounters. If they think they're going up against a big boss creature, but actually there's a few smaller minions before that, of course I'm going to have to include those few smaller minions, make them easy encounters so that when they get to the boss, it's still epic and intense, but it's not a complete rollover from the monster itself because they don't have any resources left. Also, sometimes choosing how many encounters you can fit into one gaming session is also a really good way to pace out the adventure too. This way, you can choose the encounters you want for a certain session, and you can make them more or less intense depending on how many you have. You don't want crazy back-to-back intense encounters every single time. This will burn your players out, and it'll make them think too tactically for even the most simple encounters. And they'll end up overspending resources on things that they could have just cantripped away. And on the flip side of that, you can always make your encounters more harder, that's not a word. You can always make your encounters more intense mid-combat by simply upping the amount of damage your monsters do with a berserk-like effect. Perhaps now that they're bloodied and under half hit points, they hit an extra time, or when they hit, it does extra damage or has an added effect to it, like knocking back the character. A dragon's breath might automatically recharge every 3 turns rather than on a roll of a d6, or it could recharge on a roll of a 4, 5, or 6 on that d6. Simple ideas like this can drastically change the intensity of the encounter mid-encounter, which will make your players realize that, oh, we thought this was kind of easy, but actually this thing's really, really difficult, and we need to pay more attention and see what it's doing and really try and tactically outclass this thing. This is especially good for catching veteran players who like to metagame monsters. Plus, it can also be a nice little surprise to some players to think that they're winning, and all of a sudden it becomes much, much scarier. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the action economy. Action economy is one of the things you really need to learn how to juggle as a dungeon master, especially in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. If you want it to be an intense and boss-like encounter, having one action per player for the enemy is a really good place to start. Usually these come in the form of legendary actions where the boss type monster can have an action at the end of another player's turn, activate some kind of ability, attack, or special magical property that it has attached to that monster. These are a great way to even out how much damage and how many things that the players are doing versus the big enemy you've got planned. And if you don't have a big enemy planned, there's always a really interesting way to have it a little bit more intense, but not quite as legendary. And this method I have learned online from a bunch of different dungeon masters. It's basically putting 2 monsters in one body. Say you've got an extra scary Gnoll Captain. This Gnoll Captain himself only has 1 or 2 attacks. Is simply having him have the same amount of attacks, but instead he gets 2 initiative rolls in combat. He only moves in one body and he has double the HP still, but he makes, I don't know, say 2 attacks for his multi-attack on one of his turns. A couple of players have a go. It's his turn again. He gets another 2 attacks, and then more players, comes around to his turn again, another 2 attacks. You're essentially running 2 monsters, but in one body, in one physical location. Now, this makes it a lot easier for the players to use spells to take control of the situation for this combat, but that's kind of okay. That's intended. That's how these lower level monsters, without creating legendary actions and resistances, kind of work. And you've got to remember, enemies don't always just keep attacking over and over and over again. Some of them are smarter than your average bear, and they might take more actions to actually deliberate the party and lock them down with some form of crowd control rather than always just attack, 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 attack. And remembering to adjust things on the fly. Even for someone like myself, I've got 10 years experience doing this DM gig, and I tell you, it's still difficult to adjust things and get combats right and paced right every single time. You never know what your players are holding, and you never know what they're going to do sometimes. They have great ideas that come outside of the box, and you want to reward them for those ideas, especially in combat. You might realize that the encounter you had planned was either too easy or too difficult, especially depending on how swingy your dice might be. A good tip for this can be averaging out the damage that you see in the creature's stat blocks to just take that average damage every single time. This way, your players are going to know exactly how much damage they'll take from every attack from that monster. They can look at their own HP and figure out how much damage they might want to take, whether they want to move away, a lot of different things. This will allow them to kind of tactically and strategically place themselves in better position to win the encounter. And look, I'm not one for fudging numbers at all really when it comes to this game. However, there are a couple of situations that are basically the same situation when I actually do. If the combat is starting to feel like a slog and your players are getting bored and you can tell, and the monster only has 10 hit points left, the next attack kills it. doesn't matter how much damage it does. And also, maybe on its dying breath, it lets out one last spell or one last attack to the nearest creature, just to add that little bit of intensity that might actually down a player right at the end of combat. Remember, roles help guide your story and can help guide combat, but sometimes you don't want to let them determine the fun of the game, especially when it's only something like 5 hit points. Okay, my next tip is all about monsters with a twist. So this is kind of to tie in with adjusting things on the fly, but basically, if I have a monster that I really want the players to fight against, but they are way too high of a level, or maybe they're under-leveled, sometimes it's really easy to adjust monsters for your party. Sometimes all you have to do is just have them do more damage. They can have the same AC, they can have the same amount of hit points, they can have the same amount of actions, but if that action hits a lot harder and is a lot more intense, you better believe your players are going to take even more care when dealing with this creature in this combat. I'm going to give another example of a crazed gnoll because, I don't know, I like gnolls recently. But basically, imagine if a gnoll only had a +5 to hit, and when it hit it did, I don't know, a d10 plus 3 damage. What if all of a sudden it was empowered by a fiend, and it did 2d10 plus 6 damage with its one hit? And its one hit was guided by the gnoll Yanogu himself. Yeah, see, that gets a little bit more intense, right? But he still only has a handful of hit points and a pretty low AC, so they should slap him down as quickly as possible. This kind of adjustment to your creatures actually gives a really high level of intensity on a visual level, but realistically, when the players realize what's happening in the combat and they beat this gnoll very easily, all of a sudden it becomes, wait, why was he so strong? And it drives them to investigate that part of the story for you. Changing these little things for lots of different monsters that the players are already very, very familiar with is a fun way to spice up your low-level encounters. Imagine kobolds with shields, or gnolls that could wield magic, or goblins that could summon fey creatures. These are all ways to adjust that make a little bit of work for the DM to figure out, but if you want to keep it a lot simpler, one really good way to do it is just flavor the attacks differently. Give them maybe an extra different kind of weapon that they haven't used before, or you haven't seen them use before. Maybe change the damage type for some of the spells that they cast. Simple things like that can sometimes suffice, and even just the visual representation of those creatures in combat changing can also make it more interesting and a little bit fresh. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I love giving low-level monsters legendary actions and interesting abilities that they don't have. Kobold's a dragonkin, right? What if you gave him a dragon's breath? Even if it's just a small one. Speaking of adjusting monsters, maybe we should do more of that.